I don't know. Oh, there we go. Yes, this is working. Hello, everyone. Yama. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening for a very special lecture, The 8 Days with Ray Ingrey and Dr. Paul Irish. This event marks the first in a series of lectures you may have heard about, led by the Gujaga Foundation, marking the 8 days the Endeavour was anchored at Kamay, from the 29th of April to the 6th of May 1770, and celebrating the continuation of Dharawal culture today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marika Duchinsky. I'm a Gomeroi and Mandinjari woman, and I've recently joined the Chachakwing Museum team as Curator Indigenous Heritage. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people, as well as the many Aboriginal clan groups who have honoured and cared for this place since the first sunrise. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people who join us today. As we work, visit, learn and share knowledge on this storied land, may we also respect and seek the ancient wisdom embedded forever here through the custodians who carry that knowledge with them today. I'm thrilled to see so many people gathered here this evening to do exactly that. Tonight's lecture is hosted by the University of Sydney's School of History and Philosophy of Science. I'd now like to hand over to the head of the school, Professor Dominic Murphy.
Thanks, Marika. Easy crowd. The School of History and Philosophy of Science is very proud and very honoured and happy to be sponsoring this evening. I won't keep you, except to say that we're very pleased to be able to use the work of the Perouse community with Dr. Paul Irish in our courses among our students who plainly have a great desire for it, so we're very happy to see it brought out here to a wider audience. And now I'll introduce our speakers. Ray Ingrey is a Dharawal man from the Perouse community who will tell you more in a moment about the Gujaga Foundation, and Dr. Paul Irish, who's a historian, an archaeologist, and author of Hidden in Plain View about the Aboriginal people of the Sydney Harbour area. And I'll hand this over now to the people you came to listen to.
Thanks. Thanks for coming along tonight to hear both Paul and I talk. We want to try and not to be so formal. We want to try and have a bit of a yarn as well as we go along. One of the questions Paul and I was really caught up on is, do we allow you to ask questions during the presentation or towards the end? That's probably the hardest thing to come up with. We sort of decided we'd get you to ask at the end. But if there is a burning question that you think I'm going to forget it, then I'm more than happy to do that. Most of the questions we can deal with at the end. We've got some slides to get through in regards of the 8 days, and Paul and I will bounce off each other. Before we start, I'll probably just want to share a little video with you that talks a little bit about Kamay in a way that you may not have heard before. And this was a video that we did in the lead up to the Endeavour Voyage exhibition, which I'll talk about in a sec. And it's to do with Kamay, or Kamay, as our old people pronounced it. And it shares a bit about our country. So just a little visual of Kamay is always good to see, especially if we can't be out on country ourselves. Just a little bit about the Gujaga Foundation. It was created in 2019. It came from a forward-thinking workshop our community done with our leaders. There was about 40 got together, and one of the recommendations out of that workshop was that we needed a charitable arm. We need to call it the Gujaga Foundation, and it needs to continue the language and cultural work that we do in our community. And so they took over as an organisation the cultural research and project-based work that we've been doing for 20 plus years in our community, including work with Paul, who started to work with our elders in the late 90s, Paul? Mid to late 90s? Yeah. Been around for a while, eh?
I've got the hair to prove it.
And Perouse Aboriginal Community, the name is a bit misleading because today a lot of people think Perouse is just a suburb on the northern arm of Kamay. But it actually became the name because it was the place where our people were encouraged to live permanently from 1883 onwards, when the government created the Aboriginal Protection Board. And so Aboriginal families were strongly encouraged to move to Perouse and move from places like Rose Bay, Double Bay, traditional camps around Botany Bay. And so if you wanted to engage with the government, you needed to be at Perouse. And at that time, it was well known that our community descended from the original inhabitants of that land, where not only English occupation occurred, but that broader cultural area, including Botany Bay and the Illawarra as well. Nearly 140 years later, we're still there, and we don't plan on leaving for another 140 years. So we're going to be around for a while. Brings us to the work that we've done that's sort of taken us to the Kamay spheres and where we are today. Our communities, in regards of research, it isn't unfamiliar. A lot of our old people did research in the 80s, and I acknowledge Maria is with us here today. Maria Nugent done a lot of work with our old people, and so a lot of our research team that drives our community's work, including our language, grandkids and great-grandkids of those senior women that Maria worked with in the 80s. And so research was still quite common, and obviously Paul had a relationship and still has a relationship with many of those elders from that time, particularly their kids, Uncle Shane Williams and my father David and others. So, it's not, and we've worked with Paul on a number of projects throughout the late 2000s, early 2000s. So when the opportunity came to tell our story our way, we needed to rely on people like Paul to help us build not only with the research side of things, but build our capabilities. One of the exhibition, I suppose, outcomes in the Kamay section of the Endeavour Voyage exhibition was unpacking the 8 days that the Endeavour was in Kamay. But we wanted to tell our story, the story from the shore. So we looked at diary entries, and there were some challenging, I suppose, moments for us looking at those diaries. And today we look at them and they're so simple. One's like looking at Banks's diary. He says they did this on this particular morning. But then you look at James Cook, and he's got the same activity, but on a different date. And so, again, out at poor old La Perouse, the whole, the worries of the world come down on us and was like, why have we got 2 different dates? And Paul could probably articulate that reason for us, but it was a small little community research group out at La Perouse that figured it out. We end up explaining to the NMA what it was, and they're like, oh, we got it. And without throwing anyone under the bus, even the guys here at Chow Chow Wing couldn't work out when we explained what it was. They were like, makes sense. So the history faculty can acknowledge us for dealing with the worries of the world when it comes to the Endeavour times.
It is quite interesting, given that this date in 1770 is seen, in Australia as being such a pivotal and important date, and yet the actual date is still, if you look online, 28th, 29th, sometimes the 30th of April is given as dates because people are reading these journals and trying to figure out what they mean. And the anomaly that Ray referred to is the fact that naval personnel used a different way of describing days. Their days started at midday and went till the following midday. So something that happened the following morning was listed under the day before. For reasons I didn't get that deep into it, I don't understand why, but that really has challenged a lot of people, because I think it also, funnily enough, what Ray was saying about telling the story from the shore, we've relied on these journals, plucking out, say, Cook's journal and thinking, well, this is an authoritative written account of what happened in that time. And not only can we not even agree on actual dates and times by looking at one source, there's also quite a large number of diaries. Banks and Cook are the 2 best known, but there are other journals and records from that 8 days as well. And actually pulling them all together and working out what actually happened, even from a European perspective, is the first step to then kind of coming up with the response to that. So yeah, it wasn't as simple as we thought. So we did a lot of reading and combining and checking and cross-referencing things.
And a lot of our, members of our research team are from our community. A lot of the people and that's just a small group of us. We had a lot of volunteers as well that's worked on projects over the years. But even just in that photo, there's many people there that can trace their ancestry back to Botany Bay before contact. So, and 3 of those, the ladies there are members of the Guigal clan. So they were actually doing work that was directly relating to their old ancestors. So it was actually pretty overwhelming for some of them as they're reading through the journals, but I think a lot of it was very fulfilling for the work that they did as well. Before I go any further, I just want to give you our version of the events, and then we can unpack the 8 days. This is Dr. Shane Williams. Uncle Shane is a senior Guigal elder in our community, with Uncle Rod Mason, who is our senior elder, particularly around the spears and the making of spears. And this is them telling the story of the arrival of the Endeavour. So the 8 days in Kamay. So throughout we've done a summary of what happened in the morning and the afternoon, and as Paul mentioned, there could be a couple of discrepancies because of the calendar, but this pretty much happened on day one when you look at the diaries and line them up. They came obviously into the bay, and we won't go too much into it because Uncle Shane explained from our perspective what happened. But it was definitely the point where the two men opposed the landing. So that was pretty much straight up. I think they, from day one, they came into the bay, they anchored. They knew people weren't really encouraging them to come and land, but they got the long boats out, and I think there was 2 or 3 long boats from memory that rowed in. And as Uncle Shane mentioned, stones and spears were thrown at them as well. And for us, it was those warning shots that we were providing was to not let them land, because cultural protocols, alive or dead, they were breaking cultural protocols by coming into someone else's country without actually getting permission to do so. And under our old way, that was against the law. And so they were protecting our country by not allowing them, by defending it in that sense. Did I need to add anything else for that one, Paul?
No, just maybe just to mention too that the graphics there were produced as part of the National Museum exhibition, and tried to kind of recreate some of the events that were going on and where. And again, this is something that's quite hard, not just knowing the dates, but also trying to work out where things happened around the bay in those 8 days. Sometimes it's fairly obvious, and a lot of the exploring and movement was around Kurnell, which is the southern shore of the bay there. And sometimes it's fairly easy to tell where they are, but other times we really don't know what they were doing. And for those of you who've been around Kamay, it's a big area, and now the bay seems in some ways a bit smaller because of the airport and the port on the eastern side and northern side. But to Cook and to Aboriginal people in this time, the bay extended a lot further to the north. That bend in the river you can see up the top there is now sits underneath Sydney Airport. So, and the river comes out in a different place. So the whole shape of the land has changed, which makes it also challenging to kind of look at those journals and understand where they're talking about.
So Cook in his journals said as soon as they landed, they threw spears at him. And obviously Banks said this similar thing in his journals. And so they knew straight away that there was that unwillingness to engage, unwillingness to let them to land. And for us, in Aboriginal culture, to engage with a stranger without knowing them, is not something that always happened. Very rarely would you see a stranger, and very rarely you'd have someone within your own country that doesn't belong to that country. A lot of people had to be there for a purpose, and if they weren't there for a purpose, it was questioned why they were there. So was it an act of war and stuff like that? But even what compounds it even further is that in Dharawal Dreaming Story, it explains that spirits of the dead come back in low-lying clouds from the afterlife. And so that's why they were looking at, wondering, is it these animals that were returning? Because that's another Dharawal Dreaming Story. Is it spirit of the dead? And when they saw him in human form but white, that's why they were yelling out "Warra Warra Warra," which means they are dead. So they were explaining to the people around them and to them that they're dead and they need, and they were gesturing for them to go away.
And it's important to recognise too that in those 8 days, apart from those words, they were the only words that Cook and others recorded Aboriginal people saying. They obviously were saying a lot of other things, but there was no exchange of language or learning of language. So really the tone was set by that first day and the landing as to what interactions would happen for the rest of the 8 days. And certainly the assumptions that were made about why people were behaving in certain ways, we can only read from those journals, and they're trying to sort of understand people that they can't communicate with, partly because of the way that they set up the relationship on that first day.
And I'll probably have to plug right now that on Thursday evening I'm doing a talk on Warra 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 and how that came about, and unpacking the ontology behind it, what informed us looking at those events through a spiritual lens and the language behind it. So if you're available, come along.
Probably the other thing just to mention there is Banks's quote about taking the lances we had taken from them. If you've seen the display outside, you'll know that that's what that's referring to, is the theft of the spears that are on display, and also that the other spears that Uncle Rodney's made have been made to kind of represent the spears that no longer survive, which were part of that 40 or 50 spears that were taken. And it's kind of hard to overstate what that theft would have meant for people too. It's like going outside here and taking all the cars parked here and just stealing them or something. These were tools that people used that they needed to be able to feed themselves.
Feed a community. Yeah. And I think throughout too, they talk about taking other things and as well, like other opportunities, but definitely the bundling up of 40 to 50 spears as they counted would be like, I've said it before, would be like shutting down a Coles or a Woolies in a local community. By the time our people recovered from that, it would have been damaging. And you heard Uncle Shane say in the video that men even came down and took canoes away because they thought that they were going to take those as well. And for us, our law was strong where theft wasn't a part of it. So you could leave your spears, and really the only people that could take it would be someone special to you, like a nephew or something, without asking your permission. If anyone else took it, it was actually against the law. So you could leave your spears there for days, and you would come back and it would still be there, unless, like I said, a nephew or someone took it, but they would usually put it back in the same place. So this theft was so foreign to our people, and the way they behaved at Kamay set the tone for the rest of the 8 days. So because of the reluctance, on the southern shore, there was opportunities to start to explore the northern side of the bay as well. And also too, Aboriginal people at that time took only what they needed to eat. We weren't really wasteful. So to see all these, and the bay was plentiful. A lot of places were plentiful right up into the mid to late 1800s for food source. But to start to haul in all these big hauls of fish, and later on it mentions about stingrays as well. That to us, that greed wasn't a part of our everyday life, so it would have been foreign as well. But Cook did explore the bay and noticed a lot of, shellfish and stuff being cooked on fires, and the abundance of seafood available. It's probably worth noting too that other things that they were noticing on that time was things like there was fertile land at Kurnell, so it was suitable to become a colony. Obviously 18 years later, Arthur Phillip disagreed, but that was also that shifting landscape that occurred as well. And so there was a lot of Aboriginal people that were curious of what was happening, but really reluctant to engage with the crew of the Endeavour.
I think we know also from just putting on my archaeology hat as well, around somewhere like Kurnell, there is an enormous amount of archaeological remains of Aboriginal campsites that really show just how abundant fishing and shellfish were around the bay, and also that Aboriginal people were there permanently in quite large numbers as well.
Mm-hmm. And so for us, as I mentioned, we only took what we needed. So part of the observation of looking at what happened on day 2, our people, our elders, and the group of people we worked with looked at that, was like, well, that would definitely be against our cultural practices. And our old people would be shocked on that as well. And the good animation too, we'll see the actual video in full at the end of this presentation. but the sequence group helped us pull that together as well. And I must say, Dr. Paul Irish, if he doesn't work out being a historian, he can probably get into the design, graphic design, because he did a lot of the backgrounds and told the guys how to do their jobs, which is good. Obviously, Aboriginal people were all over the bay. They could see on the southern side, the northern side, but you know, see throughout the 8 days that, you know, there was a number of opportunities where James Cook tried to engage with, or the crew of the Endeavour tried to engage with Aboriginal people, but they would just quickly disappear. So, you know, we can look at that, and from day one, what the events that happened on the first day really set, as Paul said, set the tone for the engagement throughout. And so people just kept staying away from them.
And you have this, sort of quite almost comical sort of story of like Cook recording that he's gone ashore quite desperate to try and meet people because he wants to be able to speak and understand what's going on, and sort of running down the beach trying to as people move away. And there's that sort of sense of moving to and fro, and it's from an Aboriginal point of view obviously made complete sense what they were doing. It was but you can sense the frustration, particularly from Cook, who wants to try and understand who are these people. This was the first landfall in Eastern Australia, so it's the first time that Cook and indeed any English people on the East Coast had come in contact with Aboriginal people. So he wanted to understand that, but had kind of, I guess, ruined his opportunity to some extent.
So that toing and froing, our people were curious to see what was happening and what they were there for, but didn't want to get too close. Obviously there was a violent encounter on day one, but also too that our cultural beliefs is to not engage with spirits of the dead. So there's actually a spiritual consequence to that. And so when we look at why there was this toing and froing, not wanting to get close, you see those that are familiar with history, you'd see the Tupaya drawings where people weren't. So they were still going about their daily business, spear and fish, going right near where the Endeavour and the longboats were, but they weren't physically engaging with them in eye contact. And that was avoidance customs. So that was to avoid that, the spiritual consequences of engaging with someone that we believed were dead.
It's also, I think, it pushes back against the idea that a lot of history books like to say, which was that Aboriginal people were somehow frightened and ran away. They weren't at all. If you look at that, what Ray was mentioning, if you were really petrified of these invaders, you don't take your canoe up to this enormous boat and paddle around it. So they were obviously, these were all sort of calculated actions, but just characterising this as fear because a gun was fired or something, that's a very shallow understanding, isn't it?
Yeah. On day 4, it was well written about Forby Sutherland, and on Friday we were at the meeting of two cultures, and the descendants of the Sutherland clan group was there, which is good to see. And Paul can maybe talk a little bit about this in more detail, but what we found was interesting looking at the diaries was that it was the like Sutherland was buried on land. Our understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected, but our understanding that usually out at sea was a naval burial practice at the time, but this one was buried, and it was. They noted about the churning through a lot of the midden and like the area that was there. And I'm not too sure if the Sutherland, if it still is the grave.
Well, it's one of the interesting things I was going to mention sort of a bit later on, but it's worth mentioning here that how many people have actually been out to Kurnell, to the national park, walked around, tripped over the monuments to every 5 minutes of the 8 days. But one of the interesting things about that is there's a monument to where Forby Sutherland is said to be buried, and the placement of that monument, no one who was on the Endeavour for those 8 days ever came back to Australia. So when they put up those monuments, there were no eyewitnesses that were not Aboriginal people. And so we find that there's actually an interesting recourse of Europeans to ask Aboriginal people where things happened, because the diaries weren't sort of sufficient to give that detail. That monument that's still there today was placed there because in the 1920s, when they wanted to put it up, I guess it was probably on the 150th anniversary or something, they asked one of the residents who had lived in the farm that was there in the 1840s, and he remembered being walked down the beach by his Aboriginal nanny, a senior woman, Sally Medamong, in the 1840s, who was there in 1770, and she pointed out where that white man was buried, and that's why the monument's there. Otherwise, no one would have any idea.
It's interesting to see that it was noted that Aboriginal people were pretty much everywhere but kept their distance. And there was also several spears as well were thrown on this day. Solander, Cook and Banks, even Tupai, tried to make contact, but the blackfellas at the time just didn't want anything to do with them, so disengaged and pretty much walked. But a lot of the cultural practices were also, so you see the removal of bark so that we can make our madri, our canoes, or anything that goes across the water. Towhole cuts were good for climbing the tree to catch things like gurra or possums. And if you even go out there today, you'll see a lot of the marks of the possums going up the tree on the bark. See some of those big trees out there, and there's pathways still there. So there was a lot of abundance of that as well. The other one is that the Kurnell, the headland, is a significant ceremonial place. So a lot of people say, well, why was there only a couple of men at the time? Obviously tracking the Endeavour up the coastline through those smoke signals, it may not have been anticipated that they'll call into Botany Bay like they did. But Kurnell, through our oral histories, is a big ceremonial place and a significant place. Hence, probably the painting up and of those men, and then the abundance of men that came after that as well. But a lot of the times, the warning shots, where now people looked at them, where they were going off, entering into the bush, and our men would throw stones and spears at them. It was particularly warning to not go into certain significant places as well. But definitely there was a lot of dwellings that were in and around the Kurnell Peninsula, and also on the northern side as well.
One of the things they also observed, I think it was in a quote from a couple of days before, was that the trinkets, the glass beads and so on that they'd placed in front of houses when they took things were just completely untouched. Aboriginal people didn't want anything to do with those.
Yeah, things like that, they wouldn't touch them. I'd just leave it alone and don't touch. And again, when we unpack that through our eyes, it's looking at the potential spiritual consequences of engaging with those things. We're getting there, day 5. This is where a lot of plants were collected on day 5. Obviously Banks bought a ticket, I suppose, on the voyage, and it was seen as a scientific journey. I'll probably need a plug too. On Wednesday, I think it is, in the middle of the day, we're doing a talk on the difference between the plants, the knowledge behind the plants that was collected, to the cultural knowledge, and looking at the difference if they were to just potentially engage with our people, so that first day event didn't happen. There would have been opportunity to engage and learn so much more. But there was a lot of plant collecting, and obviously Tupaya goes off and collects some birds as well. But all the time Aboriginal people are watching, are tracking, but not getting too close throughout it. The interesting one was, Tupaya, they thought because he was dark-skinned that he would be able to engage with them, but he also saw them just as one. Our people saw Tupaya as just one of them. So even though he had the similar colour, they avoided him as well, and he very reluctant to engage with him as well throughout.
And I guess until Cook arrived in Kamay, he had no idea whether all of the people in Australia were the same as in the Pacific. He didn't have that sort of sense of, they'd been in New Zealand, so they had some sense that there were more cultural groups. But one of the great consequences of not engaging with people at Kamay was when he later spent time in Cooktown and there did engage a lot with Aboriginal people and learnt language. Because he hadn't learnt language in Sydney, he had no idea that there were different languages, and so this idea grew that the language was the same everywhere. And so when the first fleet arrived, they thought they were speaking local language by using words from around northern Queensland, and Aboriginal people here had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look in those early colonial documentations. Kangaroo or gungaroo, which is a Gugu word, the Europeans were using that, and Aboriginal people were trying to learn English as faster than they were learning the local language. And our people thought sheep and cattle and all that kind of stuff was kangaroo, was English word. So, so things got, the term goanna isn't an Aboriginal word, it's iguana. It's our Aboriginal English word for iguana, because that's what the Europeans were calling it. Now people then end up saying guana for iguana, so things got a bit bastardised in that sense as well. But so very limited engagement with our people. Again, this one was interesting because even though our people obviously were still observant, they were happy to leave their campfire, even what they had cooking on the fires, to not engage with the crew of the Endeavour, and throughout this day it was documented that they would actually go and start to take some of the mussels and stuff that was left there cooking, and so they were happy. But obviously they left beads and ribbons behind, even though they weren't really getting touched the day before or the day before that. And as Uncle Shane said, Murra is our word for mullet, and so around that time the mullet season occurs, and so our people would have been out in the bay, the abundance of food source that was around as well. Again, Banks goes ashore as well, and they start to shoot for animals for part of his collection, which Aboriginal people have a spiritual connection not only to each other and to the land overall, but everything within it. And we'll touch this on Wednesday. We'll talk more about this on Wednesday. But we have dreaming stories that relate to animals and plants, and we're spiritually connected or related to them things. So when you're just cutting off Old Man Banksy or Watangari, or you're cutting off things that are part of our dreaming, etc. So to just go out and shoot animals or hoard a lot of stingrays in is quite offensive. Would have been offensive and would have been a shock to our people as well. So it was quite common for, like I said, people to leave stuff and come back to it, and obviously it was taken, so that would have been a shock. And later on they talk about the abundance of stingrays, and I think there was a bit of bragging on how big those stingrays were as food source, but the Gamangul are stingray people. So all the clan groups that belong to Kamay, the Gamangal, people belonging to Botany Bay, are Stingray people. It comes from our dreaming story on how Gamangal, how we were created, and it relates to, we come from that, so to see things being not only wasted but taken, would have been real offensive to our people and just soured that relationship. So because there was very little engagement, I think, a lot of the diaries indicate that they were concentrating on plant collection and animal collection. I think Cook tried a couple more times to engage, but just was unsuccessful. But it was a lot to do with, not that engagement. So it was, I think at that time it was like time to wrap up. And obviously throughout while they were going on the different parts of the bay, they were, measuring how big the bay is and etc. So they were doing a lot of that as well. But because there was no engagement with the locals, a lot of that interest then started to fall away. Day 7, as I mentioned, around a lot of fish. Still, the Endeavour crew taking fish and stuff out of the bay. A lot of our people, were still fishing and ignoring the crew of the Endeavour and the ship itself. When we do the work with our community, even just the movement of the Endeavour isn't like our big ships, even container ships today as we know it. They're quite slow moving. It's powered by wind, so it's quite slow moving. Even the longboats, it isn't like, we look at the bay today and you see a jet ski or a boat just speed across. It's not that at all. So it allowed, people were able to fish and still go about their daily business, and once they start to see this slow moving longboat, then they can quickly move away and not engage. For us, as I mentioned, that stingray is that spirit ancestor, so to see a lot of it being taken away, large ones, would have been quite upsetting. We know there would have been abundant because we don't eat our spirit ancestors. We know the gamangal, we know that it gets harvested, the tip of the spear gets harvested at certain times, but other than that, they're pretty much free to go. So when you're only talking about a couple of feet of water, which most of the bay would have been, then big Girawa, they like to stay in the sand, and they're the boss of that shallow water, so they can move quite freely around. And so for us to see our people, to see them being taken, it would have been quite upsetting as well.
And again, because of the lack of conversation, lack of understanding, there was no way for that to be conveyed either.
Yeah. It just would have added to the shock and the reasons for not being engaged. And those that would even read the first fleet journals, the couple of ships that came in first into Botany Bay as part of that fleet, the reception was more aggressive. They were still hearing the words warra warra wa. And I think even Philip noted that there was no way that they were going to land with that aggressiveness on the aggressors on the southern side, so they went to the northern side and quickly land. And even the colony people were still disregarding them. Even they'll come up and engage, and they'll just disregard them, go like warra, and just disengage. And the term warra was used throughout to describe Europeans throughout the first part of the colony, and our people continue to use that in a way like Waterman and stuff like that to explain, to talk about non-Aboriginal people or describe non-Aboriginal people. And then obviously in day 8, so people were still loading, they were bundling all that up. So our people looking at, obviously they need to store the fish because they've got a long way to go, but our people would have seen that from a greedy or a wasteful point of view, and probably would have been glad to see these fellas go, really. Yeah. And so at that time, Cook calls it Stingray Bay because of the abundance of stingrays and because it is one of our spirit ancestors, hence why they would have been abundant, or some people call them totems, some groups call them totems. Because it was one of our totems, they would have been abundant, but these guys were quickly called it Stingray Bay, which is, it already had a name which relates to that, but it's to do with the Kamay, the spears that we use, because that not only gave us people, but it gave us that spear. And so, you know, our working with our elders and our cultural knowledge holders, one of the comments that were made back to our research team was, well, if they would have asked us, we would have told them it already had a name. And the place was called Kamay. But obviously that first day set the tone for the rest of the
it's kind of sad that not even that could be recorded, isn't it? The actual name of the place, and it took 230 years or so for the national park to be renamed through some of the old the aunties' work there.
Yep.
To get that name reinstated, so at least now it's starting to be understood as the name.
So obviously James Cook turned around and changed its name from Stingray Bay, which held on for a little bit, but Botany Bay, you know, because of the number of plants, new plants that were discovered in the bay, you know, from a European or scientific point, yeah, you could call it discovered, but they've been out, they're our plants since time begun, and they already had language names and uses for them. And so, yeah, that engagement, you know, just wasn't there. And I suppose that's the biggest one, that first part not only set the scene for what happened in 1770, the 8 days, but also set the scene for 1788 as well. So after this little video, we can go to questions. But this animation just shows not only an overview of those 8 days and what happened, but you'll see what Paul was mentioning earlier about how the bay's changed over time. How Kamay's changed, and it's a pretty overdeveloped bay at this stage, point in time. Looking at some of those, you'll see like the lines and stuff, that's obviously the Endeavour crew measuring out the bay and identifying where there's fresh water, and those fresh water sources are still known. And it was interesting talking to some of the elders, because in some of the diaries, not only, you know, in 1788 as well, you know, they talk about barrels of fresh water being collected, placed under these fresh water streams that just run out. So we've got a place called Bunnaby, which is the north arm of Botany Bay, that headland, and that's just because there's a fresh water source that comes out of there, hence its name. And our elders, when we unpacked that with them, they said, oh, fancy that, you know, leaving containers under there, because that's what they used to do. They remember their parents, and they'd go up and spend days along Pussycat, Cruey Cove and stuff on the northern arm, and they would leave containers under the fresh water, so when they come back after fishing and diving and playing all day, they've got containers full of fresh water to either drink there on the spot or carry home with them. So I was interested in that they were able to connect those two types of behaviours, from the Endeavour and the First Fleet collecting water to what they were doing in their own lifetimes as well.
pretty amazing part of the world.
Any questions?
I wanted to ask again about the point you made about Fort Sutherland, that it wasn't buried at sea, it was buried on land. Was this because there's a psychological sense that there was ownership? You know, it's a bit like Rupert Brooke, lived in England because some soldier died in France. You know? Is it a little bit of England by the fact that they're buried?
Not actually sure what the reason was. I don't think it's that. I think it was a pragmatic measure. But it's then become kind of emblematic. You know, the whole of Sutherland Shire is named after that one event, and that's sort of added to the kind of history of the area. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly why it was not at sea. But I guess they weren't at sea. They were sort of in a bay. Maybe the custom is for it to be out in the ocean. So.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you both so much. That was amazing.
I think we've got a mic. We've got to frame a mic.
I can project.
There are people, I think, listening to
Oh,
the
okay.
recording, so you might want to
Okay, cool.
make it a bit easier for those.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for the presentation. That was amazing. I just wanted to ask. So on the first day, they attempt to land. There's the interaction there. The Kamay people, they retreat, and then the Marines and Cook and Banks dig the wells, and they take the spears and the shield. What do we have any insight into? Did they just walk? How did that process look? Do we have detail on what happened there, or did they just walk in from the beach to a camp and just take stuff, or do we have any detail around that? Basically, is just my question.
The camp was very close to the beach, and in fact, where the landing took place, and all along that foreshore is an Aboriginal campsite that's a couple of thousand years old and was used up to and after the time that Cook and the First Fleet and the early farmers were there. So that it was very close by, and they went straight up on shore. I think they were fearing that the spears that had been thrown at them were poisoned, and that was ostensibly the reason. But they quickly realised, as one of the quotes said, that these were fishing spears, but they still kept them. But I think if you know the kind of lay of the land there's sort of a flat area along the foreshore, and then there's a big sand dune. So it doesn't actually take much for people to kind of disappear, to go over there and be, well and truly out of sight, but still potentially quite close by.
I think a lot of our people, when they talk about what happened, the moment in time, it became a thing where our old people would say, "Oh, I was alive when Cook was here, or I was alive when the Dunbar, crashed near Watson's Bay." So a lot of Aboriginal people over time talks about that point in time. We do know that there was a lot of people in and around. Even in the early years of the colony, people are trying to put a number on it, and into thousands, but that was the only people that they could see. As for the camps and stuff, they're not. The camps weren't like we know today. They weren't permanent camps. They were seasonal camps. So a lot of our families would have been in and around there. A lot of those structures would be used a number of different times throughout the seasons. They just come back and replenish, so it isn't like they could have just packed their stuff up and go. But yeah, definitely a lot of people in and around that area. It's just that they quickly moved away, and I think even in one of the diary entries. There was an old person that couldn't move as quick, so there was a young person, a female and a child that stayed behind, and they were pretty much like didn't want to leave in one of the diaries. I think that was in the 1788 one. But yeah, definitely a lot of camps around, but it wasn't like everyone just vanished and then left the place. Like's assumed in Sydney, everyone assumes that everyone just left and vanished, not understanding they've got ties to all over this part of Sydney.
It is very hard at a sort of really micro level to kind of know exactly where Cook and Banks and others went, as we said at the start too. So you can sit there with maps and know the landscape and still, you know, really not be quite sure how far one way they went. But they did spend a few days exploring around Kurnell particularly.
We have a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Would it have made any difference if the strategy of the people living there had not, you know, instead of treating them as ghosts and not engaging, if they'd been aggressive and treated them as invading people? Would that have changed things from both the European and from the Indigenous side? If there'd been really strong armed opposition? Did anybody regret at any point just seeing them as ghosts?
No, I think a lot of our elders talk about the violence that occurred. So the shooting of the musket, even though there was one that was a warning shot, and then the other one hit the gentleman in the leg. Yeah, that was a bit overwhelming in itself. Like this new fire, this stick that just immediately hit you without even seeing it coming. So I think if an aggressive response, it would have went in two ways. It would have been that they would have speared probably most of the crew of the Endeavour, or there would have been more Aboriginal people would have died on the beach at that point. I don't think from a cultural point of view if they would have been more aggressive to them, like seen them as ghosts or not, and been more aggressive, because either way they were intruding on land that they weren't invited to come on. And so I think the treatment of those two warriors would have been no different if they thought they were ghosts or not. Maybe just the language they were saying would have been changed. So rather than saying they're dead, they would have been trying to identify that they were other blackfellas from somewhere else, like strangers or something.
There's also, you know, a lot of cultural protocols behind a lot of these behaviours that we're sort of trying to unpack and understand, and I guess, you know, we will never know exactly all of the dynamics at play either, but simply, like all of the actions, even if it hadn't been that the Endeavour crew were seen as ghosts, like all of the actions that happened would still have been governed by these same cultural understandings, and just simply, you know, spearing everyone en masse probably, you know, I don't know what would have sort of led to that. That's not really the way that sort of cultural practices worked, really, is it?
No. I think we've got to, and then...
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very informative. My question's about the spears themselves, and I know they're here in Sydney for the first time, but wondering what the possibility is that they'll be returned permanently.
Did you want me to?
Yeah.
Our elders started advocating for the return of cultural objects, and the spears became, you know, probably front and centre of that in the mid to late 90s. By the early 2000s, came to realise that the likelihood of repatriation from an institution in the UK was very unlikely. Don't get me wrong, repatriation is probably what we want, but we also need time then. If tomorrow the UK said we're going to return all these objects to you, to your community, we would be overwhelmed. We wouldn't be able to store them, we wouldn't be able to house them. And so we really need to have a good conversation around where that will be, and we've come to the conclusion, our elders came to the conclusion back then, if we can't have them, we're going to create a positive relationship with these institutions so that we can loan them, long-term loan, however long that may be, and be able to access them for education purposes for the younger generation. They were realists in their thinking. They knew that if the spears weren't taken, we wouldn't be looking at them today. My grandmother talked about when she was young up at Cape Bank, so on the northern headland of Kamay, as a young girl, came across a full spear and picked it up and it perished in their hands. You know, so they knew from those experiences that they don't last long in the environment outside of a museum grade facility. So our strategy is to have a museum grade facility at a place like Kurnell, so that would give confidence to the cultural institutions overseas that hold these, so that we could have them back as long-term loan, display it at Kundal for our community to access, for the broader community to access and have a look at, and for our young kids to have a look at them and use them for education purposes, because that old way of making those spears is still there in our community. And people like Uncle Rod Mason's been teaching them to our community, our young ones, for decades now. So it'd be good to just showcase. So that's the long-term strategy. If we can't have them back, let's get a museum grade facility on country where we can house them for a long-term loan. And a 20-year loan is better than a 0-year loan. Yeah, no worries.
Thank you. Would they have thought of if they thought when they thought they were ghosts or their ancestors, would they have thought of them as their own ancestors or as ancestors of some other nation? And
Yeah.
that's why they didn't ask for permission to come.
Yeah, if they were, and I'd love to have a time machine. If Sydney Uni's got a time machine in the bottom of their basement somewhere, me, Paul and Maria will go on a trip. But because they saw them, they knew they were coming up from the coast, up the coast. If they were to see them as their own people, they would have, Aboriginal people that is, they would have been not Dharawal people.
Ah, right.
So they would have been treated exactly the same.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any? Oh, we got one over. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, think that was an interesting talk. I was just interested in your response to that question about the spears and them kind of being perishable. And earlier in the talk, you mentioned that like taking the spears is almost like taking their car. So like the spears are obviously very important, but is it fair to say that the kind of cultural significance of the spears has transformed because of kind of this history that we're talking about? Like
Yeah, I mean, I think spears would have been important to the makers and the users of them, like any implement. And we're focusing on spears, but obviously Aboriginal people had a wide range of things that they used. And obviously the significance of these spears is because not only were they taken, but there's only a few of the ones that were taken that are left. And so I think they would have been significant, in a very, personal sense, because they were also individual styles. And so, you would have known in your local group if there was a spear standing outside a hut, everyone would have known whose that was. It would have been obvious either by style or just communal knowledge. So I don't think there would have been a sense that these were somehow, significant across, Kamay or across Sydney or across Australia in the way that they've gained that significance now. That's not to say they weren't important, obviously very important day-to-day items, and they could be made, as Uncle Rod demonstrates now. It's not that they would have taken months and months to make another fishing spear, but you'd look at 40 or 50 spears from one settlement, which may have been a few families. That would have been a huge and immediate loss that would have taken a long time to replenish.
Because also spears, it's not like, we'll find a straight one and cut it down. Uncle Rod teaches our kids it's around management, so they need to manage, so they need to burn the land, the spears then grow straighter. He said the other day to us that it's like non-Aboriginal people tend to their gardens. You've got to do a lot of work to get your garden and your food source up. That's the same with us with land management. So it takes a while, and then obviously everything is done in a spiritual way, because you need to take the life of an animal, you need to take a life of a plant, you need to extract certain things from certain plants to make the spears like them ones. And then when they're used in the utmost respect as well. And to pause one about the cars, I suppose it's like saving up for your first car. How long does it take you to save up for your first car, only to, walk out of a shopping centre and it's been stolen, You'd be cursed, especially if you're not insured, So there goes your livelihood, So the spear's a similar way in that context. Oh, up there.
Thank you both for that. That was terrific. I've got a question about trinkets and beads. So Cook and Banks bring trinkets and beads, and people don't want them. And this is, you may not be able to answer this anyway, but 100 years later, they're still bringing trinkets and beads. And I wonder why they didn't work out that we didn't need trinkets and beads.
I'm going to step way outside my knowledge here and say that, obviously someone like Cook was interacting with people over an enormous area and lots of different cultural practices, and I guess it's hard to know how other groups might have wanted to or been able to incorporate those kind of goods into their cultural understanding of the world, but also their economic understanding. But clearly, in Kamay, they just were like a mirror or a bead or something, had no intrinsic value, and we don't know what happened after that. There is a couple of Aboriginal sites around Kamay and south of Kamay where beads have been found, incorporated into these sites. Whether that means that they were discarded or whether they were used for 50 years and then discarded, we don't really know that. We know, I guess, later on that things like metal axes and metal fish hooks, when the first fleet arrived, were very quickly incorporated into Aboriginal life, but that was very pragmatic. I mean, these things had an obvious use and had a value in the same way that stone axes had a value that could be traded. So I guess potentially with cultures that might have seen or had some equivalent of a bead or some value attached to those kind of goods, maybe they were useful. I guess maybe the other thing is they didn't really care or think that deeply about it.
Just on Paul's point around the metal hatchets and stuff, is that it was, in Sydney in the early days, that trade for useful things was actually quite picked up. So a lot of the objects that we're working on at the moment, you got to think, was that taken or was that given over willingly because they were getting a trade? Metal hatchets were one of the most popular things within the first few colonies. And so, just imagine if there was an opportunity in that 8 days to actually trade something valuable. From our point of view, how much more knowledge and wealth would have been captured in those 8 days? Yeah.
I think one of the first recorded actions when the first fleet arrived was that there was a was it a club? I can't remember what was traded now, but for a mirror, a piece of glass, and that was recorded as a trade. It wasn't a theft; it was an actual trade, and perhaps there'd been time to contextualise some of what Cook had left behind. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know the motivations behind these things, but there definitely was that sort of exchange then going on, as well as a lot of continuing theft. And I do remember there was an interaction in Sydney. One of the First Fleet diaries records where an old man was approached, I think on the north side of the harbour, and wanted a metal hatchet, which was they became a bit of like currency when the First Fleet were cruising around the harbour. They'd bring, a few hatchets with them because they knew that they were popular. And whoever the European was wanted this senior man's spear, and there was no way, even though he wanted the hatchet, he was not giving up that spear. So it does but he was willing to trade other things. So it does suggest certain things had different value too.
Just conscious I've already asked a question, so if someone just do. But I just wanted to ask, and it's probably referable to what they were doing with the fish and the animals, but is there any justification in Banks or Cook's diaries? Like you said that they took the spears because they thought they might be poisoned. Is there any justification whatsoever for why they took 40 or 50? Like, because it would have, presumably it would have been quite an administrative task to carry 40 or 50 spears back to their boats. Did they say why they were doing it, or were they just trying to take as many as possible?
They just took them all. Yeah, they took all of the spears they could find, sitting around the camp. And I don't think there are records later on of them taking more spears from other camps. They took other things like oysters cooking on the fire and things like that. But that I think was the motivation for taking those spears. But they just took everything that was in that camp.
And the Endeavour had limited space to take things back, so that's why it seemed so short, because they were cut down and easy to transport, etc. So they probably would have taken more if they had the space to tow it back. And we don't know what was lost too when it hit the reef up in North Queensland as well.
Yeah, we don't actually know when the 40 or 50 spears became 4. I don't know how many of them actually ended up back in England.
Okay, I think we have to wrap it up. So thank you all for coming, and thanks very much indeed to Ray and Paul.